The blue and red lights reflected in Aaron Bennett's rearview mirror, painting his calm face in the colors of accusation. He'd spent his life defending justice, but tonight, behind the wheel of his own car, he was about to discover what it felt like to be on the wrong side of the badge. The evening air was cool and crisp, the kind of autumn night that makes you grateful to be heading home. Aaron Bennett sat behind the wheel of his black sedan, his tie loosened after a long day, his mind already drifting toward the comfort waiting for him. His wife's beef stew. The smell of it would fill the house, warm and welcoming, a small reward after hours of meetings with community leaders across Richmond, Virginia. Aaron was tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that comes from doing meaningful work. At 48 years old, he'd learned to appreciate these quiet moments. The drive home, the familiar streets, the promise of rest. He turned onto Maple Ridge Boulevard, a tree-lined street where the houses sat back from the road, their porch lights glowing softly in the dusk. He checked his speed. 28 miles per hour in a 35 zone. Safe, steady, exactly how he always drove. And then, out of nowhere, his rearview mirror exploded with color. Blue and red lights flashed behind him, slicing through the peaceful evening like a knife. The sudden wail of a siren shattered the quiet. Aaron's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his heart rate picking up despite himself. He glanced at the speedometer again, as if it might have changed in the last few seconds. Still 28. He mentally cataloged everything. His driving had been perfect. His lights were working. His registration was current. So why was he being pulled over? Stay calm, he whispered to himself, the words barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat. He put on his turn signal, slowed down carefully, and guided his car to the side of the road. As he came to a stop, he took a deep breath and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. This wasn't his first time being stopped by police. It wasn't even his 10th time. Aaron had learned long ago that in these situations, everything mattered. Your tone of voice, the speed of your movements, where you put your hands. These weren't lessons he'd learned because he was a criminal. He'd learned them because he was a black man in America, and sometimes that was enough to make you suspicious in someone's eyes. Through his side mirror, he watched as an officer approached his car with quick, aggressive steps. Another officer stayed back near the rear of his vehicle, hand resting on his holstered weapon. The message was clear even before anyone spoke. They saw him as a threat. The first officer reached his window and immediately shone a flashlight directly into Aaron's face. The beam was blinding, deliberate, meant to disorient. Aaron squinted but didn't move his hands from the wheel. "Where's the fire tonight?" the officer demanded. His voice wasn't curious. It was accusatory, dripping with suspicion that seemed to have no basis in reality. "No fire, officer," Aaron replied, keeping his voice even and respectful. "I'm just heading home after work." The flashlight beam swept across his face again, then darted around the interior of his car, the passenger seat, the center console, the back seat, searching for something, anything, to justify this stop. The officer's jaw was tight, his posture aggressive. "License and registration," he barked, completely ignoring Aaron's response, as if his words didn't even matter. Aaron moved slowly, telegraphing every motion. "I'm reaching into my glove compartment. Now for my registration," he said clearly. "My license is in my wallet. I'll get that next." He'd done this before. Narrate everything. Make sure they know you're not reaching for a weapon. Make sure they can't say later that you made a sudden movement. It was exhausting, having to perform compliance like this, but it was survival. The officer didn't respond, but his posture grew even more rigid. The second officer shifted his weight, hand still on his gun. "Do you know why I stopped you?" the first officer asked, though it didn't sound like a real question. It sounded like the beginning of a script he'd memorized. Before Aaron could even try to answer, the officer continued, "You were driving erratically back there, swerving into the opposite lane." Aaron frowned, confusion mixed with a growing sense of dread. "With all due respect, officer, I wasn't swerving. I was driving straight in my lane. My vehicle has a dash cam that can verify that." The moment the words left his mouth, he saw the officer's expression change. It wasn't relief or understanding. It was anger. "Dash cam, huh? The officer's voice was sharp now, aggressive. "That'll be confiscated as evidence. Step out of the vehicle." Aaron's stomach dropped. This was escalating and fast for no reason he could understand. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I'm complying with everything you've asked." "I said, don't. Step out of the vehicle, now." There was no room for discussion in that tone, no space for questions. Aaron unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, keeping his hands visible as he opened the door. Before he could even fully stand up, the second officer grabbed his arm and yanked him toward the patrol car with unnecessary force. The grip was tight, painful, meant to intimidate. "Is this really necessary?" Aaron asked, his voice still measured despite the alarm bells ringing in his head. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Resisting, huh?" the first officer sneered, and Aaron could hear the satisfaction in his voice, as if he'd been waiting for an excuse. "You want to play that game? Fine by me." Cold metal closed around Aaron's wrists. The handcuffs bit into his skin, tight and unforgiving. The sound of them clicking shut seemed impossibly loud in the quiet evening. This couldn't be happening. But it was. As the officers pushed him roughly toward their patrol car, Aaron glanced down the street. Lights had come on in several houses. He could see silhouettes in windows, neighbors drawn by the commotion, watching from the safety of their homes, but not one of them came outside. Not one approached to ask what was happening. Not one pulled out a phone to record what was clearly an unjust arrest. They just watched. Aaron understood their fear, their reluctance to get involved, but it still stung. In moments like these, silence felt like complicity. The officers shoved him into the back seat of the patrol car, and the door slammed shut with a heavy thud. Aaron sat there, hands cuffed behind him, staring out at the street where just minutes ago he'd been thinking about beef stew and a quiet evening at home. Now he was under arrest, for nothing. But as the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Aaron made himself a promise. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. These officers had no idea who they were dealing with. And before this was finished, the truth would come out. All of it. The patrol car bounced over uneven pavement as it carried Aaron through the streets of Richmond toward the precinct. He sat stiffly in the back seat, his wrists aching from the too tight handcuffs, watching the city blur past the window. But his mind wasn't on the scenery. It was working, calculating, planning. In the front seat, the two officers, he'd heard them call each other Patterson and Hayes, were talking like they were discussing the weather, casual and relaxed, as if they hadn't just violated someone's rights. Officer Patterson, the younger of the two, glanced at Aaron in the rearview mirror. There was a smirk on his face that made Aaron's blood run cold. "So what's your story?" Patterson asked, his tone mocking. "Late night drug run, or do you just enjoy making our jobs difficult?" Aaron met his eyes in the mirror, his expression calm. "I'm simply a man trying to get home to his family." "Yeah, sure," Officer Hayes snorted from the driver's seat. He was stocky, older, with the air of someone who'd been doing this job too long and had stopped caring about doing it right. "We hear that all the time. Reckless drivers always have excuses." Aaron wanted to argue. He wanted to explain that he hadn't been driving recklessly, that they had no legitimate reason to stop him, that this entire situation was a violation of everything law enforcement was supposed to stand for. But he bit his tongue. Arguing now would only make things worse. He knew that. He'd seen it happen too many times. So he stayed quiet, breathing slowly, keeping himself centered. He knew his rights, he knew the system, and he knew that right now, in the back of this patrol car, the odds were not in his favor. But that would change. He just had to be patient. When they arrived at the precinct, harsh fluorescent lights flooded the holding area, making everything look cold and sterile. Patterson removed Aaron's handcuffs with an exaggerated flourish, his smirk still firmly in place. "Welcome to our humble establishment," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Make yourself comfortable. You're going to be here a while." Aaron rubbed his wrist, trying to restore circulation where the cuffs had cut off blood flow. "Am I being formally charged with something?" Hayes laughed. "We'll figure that out and let you know. Just sit tight." They led him to a small holding cell at the back of the precinct. The space was barely 6 feet by 8 feet, with a metal bench bolted to the wall and nothing else. No blanket, no pillow, just cold concrete and colder metal. The door clanged shut behind him, the sound echoing through the space, final and isolating. Aaron sat down on the bench and let out a long, slow breath. The metal was cold beneath him, uncomfortable, designed to make you feel every minute you spent there. He looked around the small cell, taking it all in, and then he closed his eyes. He'd spent years, decades, building a career around principles of justice and fairness. He'd fought for reform. He'd advocated for accountability. He'd stood up in meeting after meeting, arguing that law enforcement had to do better, had to be better. And now here he was, sitting in a holding cell, arrested for nothing, subjected to the exact abuse of power he'd spent his life fighting against. The irony wasn't lost on him. Outside the cell, he could hear Patterson and Hayes talking, their voices carried in the quiet precinct. "Nothing on his record," Patterson was saying, sounding disappointed. "License is clean, registration is current, vehicles registered to him." "Doesn't matter," Hayes replied, and Aaron could hear the smirk in his voice even without seeing it. "We'll find something. Guys like him always have skeletons in the closet." Guys like him. Aaron opened his eyes. His expression didn't change. He didn't get angry. Anger was an emotion that could be used against you. Instead, he simply noted it, filed it away with all the other evidence he was mentally collecting. He wasn't angry. He was calculating. Hours passed. The fluorescent lights never dimmed, making it impossible to tell what time it was without a watch, which they'd taken from him. Other officers came and went through the precinct, some glancing curiously at the man sitting calmly in the holding cell, others not even bothering to look. None of them recognized him. But Aaron didn't expect them to. He'd only been in his new position for 3 weeks, and he'd been intentionally low profile, preferring to observe and learn before making his presence fully known. That was about to change. As the night wore on, Aaron sat in silence, his mind never stopping. He thought about his wife, who would be worried by now. He thought about the community leaders he'd met with earlier that day, the conversations about building trust between police and the people they served. He thought about all the reforms he'd been planning to implement, all the changes he wanted to make. And he thought about Patterson and Hayes and how many other people they'd done this to. How many other black men had been pulled over for no reason, arrested on false charges, treated like criminals when they had done nothing wrong. How many others had sat in cells like this one, angry and afraid and helpless. But Aaron wasn't helpless. He just had to wait for the right moment. That moment came as dawn began to break outside, painting the sky with soft streaks of orange and pink. He heard footsteps approaching the cell, different from the casual shuffle of the officers who'd passed by during the night. These footsteps were purposeful, authoritative. A woman appeared in front of his cell. She was in uniform, her bearing immediately communicating competence and professionalism. Her badge read Lieutenant Carter, and everything about her demeanor was different from Patterson and Hayes. She looked at Aaron, then down at the paperwork in her hand, and her frown deepened. "What exactly is going on here?" she demanded, turning as Patterson appeared from around a corner. "We picked him up last night," Patterson explained casually, "reckless driving and resisting arrest." Lieutenant Carter's eyebrow arched. "Reckless driving? Where's your evidence?" "We haven't processed everything yet," Hayes called from across the room, leaning against a desk like he had all the time in the world. Carter's jaw tightened. She turned back to Aaron, her expression professional but concerned. "Sir, do you understand why you were stopped?" Aaron stood up, meeting her gaze directly. His voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone who knew exactly what was happening and wasn't afraid of it. "I was told it was for reckless driving, which I categorically deny. I also have dash cam footage in my vehicle that will verify I was driving properly and safely." Lieutenant Carter's expression shifted. She turned back to Patterson and Hayes, and her voice dropped to a tone that made both men stand up straighter. "You didn't review his dash cam footage before bringing him in?" Hayes shrugged. "We didn't get to it yet." The look on Carter's face could have frozen fire. "Retrieve it. Review it. Now, and both of you, my office, immediately." As Patterson and Hayes slunk away, their casual confidence evaporating, Aaron allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The tide was turning. But this was just the beginning. The real reckoning was still to come, And when it did, Patterson and Hayes were going to learn a lesson they'd never forget. Aaron sat back down on the bench, his hands folded calmly in his lap, and waited. He was very good at waiting, and he was even better at making sure justice was served. Lieutenant Carter's office was small and functional, a desk, two chairs, a filing cabinet, and nothing else. No decorations, no personal touches, just the tools needed to do the job. She sat behind her desk now, a tablet in her hands, her jaw tight as she watched the dash cam footage for the second time. Aaron stood near the door of his holding cell, watching her through the glass window of her office. He could see her expression changing as she watched, confusion turning to anger turning to something that looked a lot like disgust. After what felt like an eternity, she set the tablet down and walked back to where Aaron waited. When she unlocked the cell door, the click of the lock sounded like freedom. "Mr. Bennett," she said, and her voice was different now. Professional, yes, but also apologetic in a way that told Aaron she understood exactly what had happened to him. "I've reviewed your dash cam footage. I've also reviewed the body cam footage from Officers Patterson and Hayes." She paused, and Aaron could see her choosing her words carefully. "This should never have happened. The footage contradicts their report entirely. You were driving perfectly. You were compliant at every stage. There was no legitimate reason for this stop, and certainly no reason for your arrest." Aaron nodded slowly. He wasn't surprised, but hearing it confirmed still felt important. "I'm releasing you immediately," Carter continued. "But I'd like to discuss next steps, if you're willing, privately." 5 minutes later, Aaron sat across from her in that sparse office. The tablet lay between them, the damning evidence frozen on its screen. "I'll be filing a formal complaint against Patterson and Hayes," Carter said, her hands folded on the desk. "This kind of behavior has no place in law enforcement. But I need to ask you something." She leaned forward slightly, studying his face. "Who are you really? Most people who go through what you just went through would be angry, upset, demanding lawyers. But you're sitting there like you expected all of this, like you knew exactly how it would play out." Aaron allowed himself a small smile. "I appreciate your diligence, Lieutenant. Let's just say I've been in similar situations before. I've learned that staying calm is the best strategy." Carter studied him for another moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. But I have a feeling this story isn't over." "No," Aaron agreed, standing up. "It's not." The early morning sun felt warm on Aaron's face as he walked out of the precinct. For a moment, he just stood there on the steps, breathing in the fresh air, feeling the tension of the night drain from his shoulders. But he didn't go home. Instead, he got in his car, which had been returned to him along with all his belongings, and drove across town to his office. Not the home office where he worked on community projects. His other office, the one most people in this precinct didn't know he had. When he pulled into the parking lot, he drove past several empty spaces and pulled into one marked "Reserved." The sign above it was simple: Chief of Police. Aaron sat in his car for a moment, looking at that sign, thinking about the long night he'd just endured. Then he grabbed his briefcase and walked inside. His assistant, Anita, looked up from her desk as he entered, her eyes widening in surprise. "Chief Bennett, you're here early. I wasn't expecting you for another 2 hours." Aaron gave her a tired smile. "It's been a long night, Anita. Could you prepare the main briefing room for me? I need to address the entire department this afternoon." Anita's fingers paused over her keyboard. She'd worked with Aaron long enough to recognize that tone in his voice. The one that meant something significant had happened. "Of course. Should I? Is everything all right?" "It will be," Aaron said. And then more quietly, "It has to be." He walked into his office and closed the door behind him. The space was still new to him. He'd only been Richmond's police chief for 3 weeks. The desk was neat, organized. Photos of his wife and kids sat in simple frames. On the wall hung his various commendations and degrees, evidence of a career spent fighting for justice. And last night he'd experienced firsthand why that fight was still so necessary. Aaron sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. He had work to do, calls to make, a case to build. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been profiled, pulled over without cause, arrested for the crime of existing in their own skin. Patterson and Hayes had made a mistake last night. They'd assumed they could treat Aaron the way they probably treated other people, with impunity, without consequences, confident that no one would hold them accountable. They were about to learn how wrong they were. But before Aaron could take action within the department, there was another matter to address: the legal system, the courts, the official record that would determine whether Patterson and Hayes faced any consequences at all. That's where the real battle would be fought, and Aaron intended to win. 3 weeks later, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread quickly about the case. A man arrested for reckless driving and resisting arrest, claiming he'd been profiled, claiming the officers had lied. In a city still grappling with questions about police accountability, the case had drawn significant attention. Media crews lined the courthouse steps, cameras ready, reporters eager for any statement they could get. Inside, every seat was filled. Community activists sat beside curious citizens. A few off-duty officers were scattered throughout the room, their expressions carefully neutral. Aaron sat at the defendant's table, his posture relaxed despite the weight of the moment. Beside him sat Sandra Reyes, his attorney, and she was exactly the kind of lawyer you wanted in a situation like this. Sharp, unrelenting, with a reputation for dismantling weak cases with surgical precision. She was flipping through a thick folder of evidence, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She knew what was coming. So did Aaron. Across the aisle, officers Patterson and Hayes sat with their department-appointed attorney. Patterson's foot was tapping nervously against the floor, a rapid staccato that betrayed his anxiety. Hayes was trying to look unconcerned, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, but Aaron could see the tension in his shoulders. The judge entered, an older man with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that suggested he'd seen every trick in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. He called the court to order, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. "We're here today to address charges brought against Mr. Aaron Bennett," the judge said. "Prosecution, you may proceed." The prosecutor stood, a young man who looked fresh out of law school, clearly uncomfortable with the attention focused on him. He outlined the case as it had been initially reported: erratic driving, swerving into another lane, uncooperative behavior, resisting arrest. Sandra barely suppressed a smile. She leaned over to Aaron and whispered, "They're making this too easy." When it was her turn, Sandra stood with confidence, her voice commanding immediate attention from everyone in the room. "Your Honor, the charges against my client are not only baseless, they are the direct result of racial profiling and abuse of power. To prove this, I'd like to present video evidence that completely contradicts the officer's statements." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Sandra gestured to the bailiff, who dimmed the lights and started the video. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as the dashcam footage played on the screen at the front of the room. There was Aaron's car, driving steadily down Maple Ridge Boulevard. The dashboard display showed his speed, 28 miles per hour. His car never swerved, never weaved, never crossed the center line. He was driving exactly as he'd said, carefully, legally, properly. Then came the patrol car's lights, flashing suddenly for no discernible reason. Next came the body cam footage, and this was where the room's atmosphere changed completely. The footage showed the officers approaching Aaron's car, their aggressive posture evident from the first frame. The audio was crystal clear. "Where's the fire tonight?" Patterson's voice, sharp with suspicion. "No fire, officer, just heading home from work." Aaron's voice, calm and respectful. And then, barely audible but unmistakable, Patterson's muttered comment as he walked back to confer with Hayes. "Another one of these guys causing trouble." Hayes's response, caught clearly on the body cam. Figures, gasps rippled through the courtroom. Several people in the audience shook their heads. One woman in the back row put her hand over her mouth. The judge's expression grew stern, his eyes fixed on the screen. Sandra paused the video and turned to face the courtroom. "This is the professionalism displayed by Officers Patterson and Hayes. Now let's continue to the arrest itself." The footage resumed, showing Aaron carefully narrating every movement as he retrieved his registration and license. His hands were always visible, His tone was always respectful. He complied with every instruction, and yet the officers escalated, demanded he exit the vehicle, grabbed him roughly, handcuffed him while he asked calmly, "Is this really necessary?" By the time the video ended, the courtroom was thick with tension. Several jurors were frowning deeply, others looked angry. Sandra turned to face the jury, her voice clear and powerful. "This is not just an abuse of power. This is a direct violation of my client's constitutional rights, rooted in bias and prejudice. My client was arrested for one reason and one reason only, and it had nothing to do with his driving." The prosecutor stood, flustered. The officers believed they had probable cause. Sandra cut him off sharply. Probable cause based on what? Driving safely within the speed limit? Following every instruction given? Or perhaps it was the color of his skin that gave them probable cause. "Counselor," the judge warned, but his tone suggested he wasn't particularly interested in protecting the prosecution. Sandra's voice softened, but her words remained powerful. "Your Honor, before we proceed further, my client has something he'd like to share with the court." Aaron stood, adjusting his tie. He looked around the courtroom, making brief eye contact with Patterson and Hayes. Both men had gone pale. When Aaron spoke, his voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. "My name is Aaron Bennett," he said, "and I am the chief of police for Richmond, Virginia." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs. Several people turned to their neighbors, whispering frantically. A reporter in the back row started typing furiously on her phone. Patterson looked like he might be sick. Hayes's face had drained of all color. His previous confidence completely evaporated. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order in this court!" Aaron waited for the noise to die down, then continued. "I was appointed to this position 3 weeks ago, specifically to address issues of accountability and bias within the department. I chose not to disclose my position earlier because I wanted the truth to emerge organically, without interference or special treatment." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And now it has. This case isn't just about me. It's about a system that has allowed officers like Patterson and Hayes to operate without consequences for far too long. It's about the countless other people who have experienced exactly what I experienced, but who didn't have the resources or position to fight back." Aaron's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "That ends now. As your police chief, I'm committed to building a department that treats every person with dignity and respect, regardless of who they are or what they look like. We are here to serve and protect all people, not just some people." The courtroom was silent now, everyone hanging on his words. This moment isn't just about accountability for Patterson and Hayes, though they will certainly be held accountable. This is about sending a message that we will not tolerate bias in our police force. We will not tolerate abuse of power. We will not tolerate the kind of profiling that treats citizens as suspects based solely on their appearance. Aaron sat back down, his statement complete. The judge looked at the prosecution table. "Does the prosecution wish to continue?" The young prosecutor glanced at his notes, then at Patterson and Hayes, then back at the judge. "No, Your Honor. The prosecution withdraws all charges." The judge nodded slowly. "Mr. Bennett, all charges against you are hereby dismissed. Officers Patterson and Hayes, you will remain for a separate hearing regarding your conduct." He banged his gavel. "This court is adjourned." Outside the courthouse, Aaron was immediately surrounded by reporters. Cameras flashed. Microphones were thrust toward his face. Questions came from every direction. "Chief Bennett, do you have a statement? Will there be an investigation into the department? What happens to officers Patterson and Hayes?" Aaron raised his hand and the crowd gradually quieted. "This case was never just about me," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that every person in our city, regardless of their race, their background, or their circumstances, is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve." He paused, making eye contact with the cameras. "As your police chief, I'm committed to creating a department that embodies those values. We will implement comprehensive reforms. We will provide better training. We will establish clear accountability measures. and we will work tirelessly to rebuild trust with the community. A reporter called out, "What about Patterson and Hayes?" "They have been suspended pending a full investigation," Aaron replied, "and they will face consequences appropriate to their actions. But more importantly, we're going to examine our systems to understand how this behavior is allowed to continue unchecked." Another reporter, "Do you think this case will lead to real change?" Aaron smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Change doesn't happen overnight. But yes, I believe this case can be a catalyst. It's up to all of us, law enforcement, community leaders, and citizens, to do the work required to build a better system." He gave a final nod to the cameras and walked to his car, leaving the reporters buzzing behind him. But Aaron's work was far from over. The courtroom victory was important, but it was only the beginning. The next morning, Aaron stood at the front of the precinct's main briefing room. Every officer in the department was there, packed into the space, some sitting, others standing along the walls. The room was silent, tense with anticipation. Aaron looked around, taking in the faces before him. Some looked curious, others looked defensive, a few looked ashamed. "By now," Aaron began, "you've all heard about what happened to me 3 weeks ago, about my arrest by 2 officers in this department." He let that sit for a moment. "I want to be clear about something. What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger problem, a culture that has allowed bias and abuse of power to exist without adequate consequences." Some officers shifted uncomfortably. Others met his gaze directly. "We are here to serve and protect," Aaron continued, his voice growing stronger. "That's not just a motto. It's our fundamental responsibility. And if we can't uphold that responsibility for every person in this city, every person, then we have failed." He walked slowly across the front of the room. "Starting today, we're implementing changes. Mandatory bias training for every officer, stricter oversight and accountability measures, an anonymous reporting system for misconduct. Body cameras will be mandatory and must be active during every interaction with the public." He stopped, turning to face them fully. "I know some of you are thinking this is an overreaction, that what happened to me was just 2 bad officers. But I'm here to tell you, if it can happen to me, your police chief, imagine how many times it's happened to citizens who don't have my resources or position." The room remained silent, but Aaron could see his words hitting home. If you can't embrace these changes, if you can't commit to treating every person with dignity and respect, then this is not the right department for you. And I mean that. We don't need officers who see citizens as enemies. We need officers who understand that our job is to protect and serve. He let his gaze sweep across the room one final time. "We can be better. We will be better. The question is, are you willing to do the work?" Months passed. The reforms Aaron implemented began to take hold. It wasn't easy. There was resistance from some officers. There were difficult conversations. There were moments when progress felt painfully slow. But there was also change, real, measurable change. Use of force incidents decreased. Community complaints dropped. Slowly, tentatively, trust began to rebuild. One evening, Aaron attended a town hall meeting, sitting on a panel with other city leaders. The room was full of residents, many of whom had come to voice concerns, to ask questions, to demand accountability. Near the end of the meeting, a young man stood up. He couldn't have been more than 25, dressed in a hoodie and jeans, his hands shaking slightly as he held the microphone. "Chief Bennett," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, "I just want to say what you went through. That could have been me. That could have been my brother, my father, any of us." The young man paused, wiping his eyes. "Thank you for not staying silent. Thank you for using your position to fight for all of us. Because of you, maybe the next time I get pulled over, I won't have to be terrified. Maybe I'll be treated like a person instead of a threat." The room burst into applause. Aaron felt his throat tighten with emotion. When the applause died down, he spoke. "Change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. It takes commitment from everyone, police, community leaders, and citizens. But together, I believe we can build a system that truly serves everyone." He looked at the young man who'd spoken. "And you don't have to thank me. This is my job. It's all of our jobs. We owe it to each other to create a society where everyone feels safe, protected, and respected. As the town hall ended and people began to file out, Aaron stayed behind, watching them go. There was something different in the way people moved now, in the way they talked to each other. Not complete trust, not yet, but something that looked like hope. An older woman approached him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "My grandson wants to be a police officer," she said softly. "Before all of this, I was scared for him, scared of what he might become or what might happen to him. But now I think maybe he can be part of the solution instead of the problem." Aaron smiled, truly touched. "Tell him to apply. We need good people, people who want to serve for the right reasons." As he walked to his car that night, Aaron thought about everything that had happened since that night on Maple Ridge Boulevard. The fear, the injustice, the anger, the fight, but also the changes, the reforms, the conversations, the hope. It wasn't over. This fight was never truly over, but it was progress. And sometimes progress was enough to keep you going. Aaron got in his car and started the engine. This time as he drove home, no blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror. This time he made it home to his wife's beef stew. But he knew tomorrow he'd be back at work, continuing the fight. Because that's what justice required. Not a single moment of victory, but a lifetime of commitment. And Aaron Bennett was committed. For himself, for that young man at the town hall, for everyone who deserved better. The fight continued, and he would be there leading it every single day. Aaron's story reminds us that change is possible, but it requires courage, persistence, and the willingness to speak up against injustice. Whether you're a police chief or an everyday citizen, you have the power to make a difference. When you see something wrong, say something. When you see injustice, stand up. Together, we can build a world where everyone is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. What will you do with your power?